Today in world literature, we turn to the study of the poetry of North America in the first half of the 20th century. Dr. Bert Kimmelman, our presenter, suggests that we think about the literature of North America during this period as something unique, as a kind of revolutionary act. Many of the ideas that Dr. Kimmelman presents, or in his own book, The Poetics of Authorship in the Later Middle Ages, the Emergence of Modern Literary Persona, in which he begins to identify some of the trends that he speaks about in his lecture. American poets, Dr. Kimmelman states, try to fashion a particularly American sensibility. Let's turn now to the origin and characteristics of this sensibility.
By the early 20th century, the Industrial Revolution had taken such a great hold in North America that particularly the United States was beginning to see itself, and other nations were beginning to see it, as extraordinarily powerful and unique. This change led American poets to fashion a new poetry that broke away from the traditions both of the past and of Europe, that area of the world that had most fed North American immigration. It is in this context that we find young American poets seeking to fashion a peculiarly American sensibility in their writing, one that bespoke their differences from Europe and the dynamic, increasingly industrialized and technologized nature of American society. They also strove to reflect monumental changes in Western thought that had occurred in recent times. Intellectuals of the late 1800s, poets and many others, were caught up in the ideas of Karl Marx, who had provided a powerful and radical social and economic critique of capitalist society, of Sigmund Freud, who had discovered and sought to explain the existence of the human unconscious and had promulgated a medical treatment for mental illnesses, which we today call psychoanalysis, of Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, who along with other physicists and mathematicians had totally revised Sir Isaac Newton's centuries-old conception of the universe's nature and form by developing theories like relativity and quantum mechanics. Add to this mix the trauma of the First World War, called the Great War, and America's growing sense of itself as an international force, and what becomes evident is a new poetry's attempt to speak about a fundamentally new reality with authority and authenticity. Lastly, as I have already suggested, American poets, like all Americans, were feeling themselves as independent of Europe. Thus, they sought to expand a distinctively American voice, or what the poet William Carlos Williams called an American idiom, a naturally grounded language that expressed an experience unmatched anywhere else. The English language poetry these American poets had inherited came to be seen as frivolous and banal. Even the best of it could not capture the fundamentally new feelings and insights young Americans possessed. For instance, the famous elegy titled Break, Break, Break by Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was Poet Laureate of England. While it was beautiful, this poem reflected the experience and concerns of an older and other world, and its poetic strategies, that is, what is called its prosody, were now seen as predictable and therefore as less than vital. Here is the poem's last stanza. Let's read it together. Break, break, break at the foot of thy crags, O sea, but the tender grace of a day that is dead will never come back to me. Tennyson's poem mourns the death of a loved one and depicts the appropriate loneliness of the seashore. It also hints at the passing of a world, the day that is dead, that world driven into the past by the radical changes fueled in great part by technological development. The poem is formed by a British Old World voice and is made up of what modern American poets would regard as a stale voice and stale European forms such as the alternating end rhymes and what is called an iambic meter. In other words, a rhythm in each line of the poem that sounds itself out as follows: ba-bump, 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 and so on. This rhythm is only relieved by the three hard stresses of the continuous refrain in the poem, break, break, break. Let us now compare this strophe by Tennyson with two snippets of poems by his American counterparts, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, whose work gives rise to modern American poetry. Whitman is brusque and confrontational, where Tennyson is accepting, seeing the events of his life as making sense within a tradition. Here is the first line from a section of Whitman's long poem, Song of Myself. And as to you, death, and you bitter hug of mortality, it is idle to try to alarm me. Note in this line, this single line, how long the line is, and how it avoids any obvious agreement of vowel sounds, how it avoids pattern or repetition, and how arrhythmic it is, or that is to say, it is striving for a new kind of music, a decidedly modern American rhythm that reflects a different wellspring of vocabulary, and the medium more of the written word. Whitman's poem can be intoned to great effect, of course, but the music it conveys is meant to imitate plain speech, spoken sounds, not the tradition of song that Tennyson is consciously echoing. Whitman was excited by an America whose future he saw as lying before it, and as if in direct imitation, his poetic form is relatively open-ended. It embodies in its sprawling nature a form of English all its own, and not at all British. As true of Dickinson also, Whitman's diction, his word choice, his vocabulary, resists the classicism of a line like Tennyson's "at the foot of thy crags." Tennyson's phrase, tender grace, is replaced by Whitman's phrase, bitter hug of mortality. Here is a decidedly different point of view on both life and death. Even more startling is Dickinson's famous phrase in which he speaks of death as zero at the bone. For Tennyson, death resides more in another world, in a heaven, whereas for Whitman, death is seen as more worldly, as a bitter hug. And in Dickinson, death is graphically physical and technological both, as indicated by the words bone and zero. The 20th century poets take their cues from these two Americans of a past generation. For instance, both the graphic nature of modern American imagery and the textures of its speech are demonstrated in this famous poem by Williams, simply titled "The Red Wheelbarrow." So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rain water beside the white chickens. What we see in this poem is a refusal to explain the meaning of the scene presented, except that we are told that a lot depends on the things enumerated in the poem: the wheelbarrow, the water, the chickens. But a lot of what? The enigmatic nature of this poem is an effect Williams was striving for. More than this, however, he wants us to indulge ourselves in the textures and rhythms of the poem. Echoing the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé's famous dictum that poems are made out of words, not out of thoughts or theories, Williams constructs his poem, another poem of his, which he titles, with wise irony, "A Sort of Song." Let's read that now. Let the snake wait under his weed, and the writing be of words, slow and quick, sharp, to strike, quiet to wait, sleepless, through metaphor to reconcile the people and the stones. Compose, no ideas, but in things, invent. Saxifrage is my flower that splits the rocks. Here we see once again a simplicity, a down-to-earth, plain American speech, what Williams called the American idiom, which fostered two related aspects of virtually all the poetry of this time and place. One was what is often referred to as anti-poetry, such as we find beginning earlier in the reaction to the classicism of a Tennyson. Thus, Williams's friend, the poet Marion Moore, begins her famous poem called Poetry with the exquisitely timed, as if utterly candid disclosure, "I, too, dislike it." And she continues, "There are things that are important beyond all this fiddle." Note in this statement the casual but important use of the word things. She and Williams realize that for poetry to be fresh and vital in their own time, it must focus on the phenomenal realized world. Her comment is similar to Williams's formula in A Sort of Song, which we just saw, called, the formula is, "No ideas but in things." And this formula becomes a rallying cry for modernism in American verse. Furthermore, things could be either natural or artificial. Williams was especially responsible for transferring into poetry a significant development in the visual arts called the machine aesthetic. Thus, the things of the world, industrial cogs in a wheel, wheelbarrows or flowers, fit with each other to create a larger experience, and as well, seeing the world in this way was commensurably reflected in Mallarmé's and then Williams's understanding of poetry and all art as made up of things, of words, and so on. Poetry would replicate life at its purely sensual level. This philosophy in poetics was also being propounded by a friend of both Williams and Moore, Ezra Pound, who, along with other poets, started a poetic movement called Imagism. Note, for example, the thingly nature of Pound's poem In a Station of the Metro, which relies greatly on the single sense of sight. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Both the crispness of the imagery and the poem's brevity are astonishing. The idea behind the writing of this poem is expressed in a letter Pound wrote to the editor of Poetry magazine at the time, Harriet Monroe, in which he explains what he means by imagism in speaking about his friend and fellow poet Hilda Doolittle, who went under the name of H.D. Pound describes her poetry as laconic speech, objective, without slither, direct, and containing no metaphors that won't permit examination. It's straight talk. H.D. had lived with the things she wrote of. She, quote, knew them before she had any book knowledge of them. In Pound's own poetry, as we see in his brief but powerful verse about the Paris subway, the realm of experience is placed entirely in the foreground of our consciousness and expressed in sensual terms. The one abstract word in the poem is its first noun, apparition, which is meant to cue us to the viewer's mental state. Here, as in the Williams poem, natural and industrial imagery are blended. But Pound, in fact, insists that one is the other. Yet, remarkably, the industrial is not even named. It haunts the viewing of the faces encased in the black rain gear of turn-of-the-century Paris, so that they look to the poem's speaker like petals on the bough of the tree. The poem revels in the contrast here, but the deeper contrast is even more interesting. The black engines of the train and its cars that also hold the passengers, again like petals. Perfectly balanced here is the older, natural, organic world and the newer technological world. The fact that the poem is about perception, first of all, also underscores the sense of alienation the viewer feels. He or she is as if outside the frame of the painting of the station. He feels this way because, Pound feels this way because he is an American in Paris, as if back in the old classical world of Europe. But he also feels the threatened diminishment of his humanity in the face of the awesome machinery. Lastly, he feels the press of urban crowds that threaten his sense of being an individual. The crowd itself, over the time of technological progress, behaving more and more like an assembly line in a factory or like a machine itself. Pound's and indirectly America's internationalism is also demonstrated in this poem, which utilizes the subtle contrast of texture and color, focusing on a few simple leaves, reminiscent of the Chinese and especially the Japanese poetry in which Pound took a great interest. It is interesting that this poem, which is so intensely focused on the present, on the effect of a visual percept also intensely gestures toward both an Asian world halfway around the globe and to the past. Deeply buried within the imagism of Pound's poem is a mixture of anxiety and nostalgia for an older, softer world that is fast receding, its loss quintessentially captured in the snapshot of the station. Indeed, the snapshot effect is not accidental, for by this time the emergence of photography had profoundly altered the directions of all the arts, causing in painting, for instance, the inexorable urge to explore images that did not represent objective reality, and in poetry, the urge toward exploring the act of perception itself. We see this trend exemplified in the numerous poems that refer to themselves. For instance, Williams's A Sort of Song, Moore's Poetry, and another poet, Wallace Stevens, who writes a poem called Of Modern Poetry. For Stevens, the vitality and authenticity of modern poetry exists in the very moment when the world is apprehended, so that what is written about that apprehension, that world, is only a physical trace of a moment in life, a kind of historical record. What Stevens is pursuing in his vocation as a poet is, as he writes in the poem, what he pursues is the poem of the mind, in the act of finding what will suffice. It has not always had to find. The scene was set. It repeated what was in the script. Then the theater changed, and so on. The poem's searching for a truth that can be expressed in verse has been, in other words, confounded by the profound changes of the last century. Yet, as all modern poetry tells us in its radical experiments, that search is actually the realization of human being, and thus is poetry itself.
Dr. Kimmelman's approach here is deeply historical. He says that we should consider the origins of North American poetry so that we may better know its qualities. As we move later in the course to the poetry of Latin America and the Caribbean, and to the poetry of Australia and New Zealand, we will see that a historical context is important to our understanding of the work. Yet, we must also remember that a poem, whether it is written by William Carlos Williams or by the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott, still must stand on its formal elements, its use of figurative language, of structure, of rhythm, a stanza. It is within these elements, as Dr. Kimmelman demonstrates in his reading of Ezra Pound's In a Station of the Metro, that we find the freshness and the vitality of poetic vision.